Welcome back, everybody. This is part 2 of your introduction to the Victorian period. This is where we're really going to get into the nuts and bolts of what was going on in the literary art world during this time period. Some of the ways that artists were engaging with their times, the issues of their day, time and place, and some of the ways that other art modes like painting and music and drama were influencing poetry and fiction. These various art modes were beginning to really kind of have stylistic dialogues together, which we'll explore a little bit in this video. Buckle up. So there was an overlap between what we call the Victorian period and the period of Romanticism. If you check the dates in your syllabus, you'll notice first wave Romanticism, capital R, the very first version of Romanticism, is going strong right through to about 1850. The Victorian period begins a little backwards in about 1830. So it's perfectly normal that much of Victorian literature preserves strong evidence of Romantic influence. It's really still a going concern at this point. But Victorian writers did make their own renovations to the movement. They gave it their own style. They kind of adjusted its levels of realism and flavor to better reflect their contemporary worldview. If you kind of almost picture the Victorians as like music mixers, sort of fiddling with the dials and adjusting the levels and volumes on Romanticism as a movement or a style in literature, updating it to their own times, you'll kind of have the picture of things. For the most part, the Victorians tamed it down a little bit. Like they said, Romanticism, yes, but like whoa bear. Just take it easy. Because the Victorian period also overlapped with, or began the transition into the modernist period, which we're going to cover in a few weeks. The modernist period is kind of what would ring in the 20th century. It was being sort of seeded now by the Industrial Revolution here in the Victorian period, but it would really get kind of like cranked into high gear by the First World War. So between the totally unbridled passion and the imaginative verve of the Romantics behind them, and the scientific skepticism, even the eventual disillusionment of what will be the modernist era ahead of them, right between those two, you've got the Victorians wedged like a kind of middle child. In our poetry readings from the Romantic period, we read William Wordsworth's poem, "The World is Too Much With Us," in which he writes, "Getting and spending we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours, we have given our hearts away." And Wordsworth is lamenting the way that individuals are being alienated from nature and from themselves by the rise of industrialization and empire. And the Victorian period really carried on this trend and these concerns, such that in Alfred Tennyson's piece, Locksley Hall, which we don't cover, but he writes this really telling line. He says, "The individual withers, and the world is more and more." First wave Romanticism had really resisted that tidal pull of, the individual withers and the world is more and more. With its emphasis on emotion, on nature, on the inner life of the individual. That was Romanticism's resistance. And Victorian literature's returns to Romanticism, albeit in their own kind of new key. Jane Eyre, which some of you will read in a couple of weeks, is what we might call neo-Romanticism. These works continue that resistance. And Victorian literature does that work in dialogue with a bunch of other art forms, as we'll discuss. This video will set out a bunch of examples of those sort of inter-art dialogues. But I wanted to begin, before we do some of that, with a kind of case study on how the Victorian literature middle child was negotiating between Romantic norms and more modern norms, what I call the Victorian period's romantic heart and modern mind. And I want to do that by looking at the short story that I posted for you guys, The Speckled Band, which is a Sherlock Holmes mystery by Arthur Conan Doyle. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Sherlock Holmes. It has been beloved ever since it was first published in the Victorian period. It has been reprised and remodeled and turned into movies and TV shows. I'm sure many of you know the Benedict Cumberbatch update because it's fabulous. But this original example of a Sherlock Holmes story is a really good case study in what makes Victorian literature Victorian, exactly. So, the Victorian period, as discussed in the previous video, was a cultural and scientific and even spiritual kind of sea change, precipitated by the Industrial Revolution. Think about these quotes from the first page or so of The Speckled Band. The story is narrated by Sherlock Holmes' best friend, Dr. Watson. Quote, "In glancing over my notes from the 70-odd cases in which I have during the last 8 years studied the methods of my friend Sherlock Holmes, I find many tragic, some comic, a large number merely strange, but none commonplace. For, working as he did, rather for the love of his art than for the acquirement of wealth, he refused to associate himself with any investigation which did not tend towards the unusual and even the fantastic." You can just smell it. You can smell romanticism cooking in there already, but take this as well. New quote. "I had no keener pleasure than in following Holmes in his professional investigations and in admiring the rapid deductions, as swift as intuitions, and yet always founded on a logical basis, with which he unraveled the problems which were submitted to him." Quick as intuitions, and yet, what does he say? And yet always founded on a logical basis. The very concept of Sherlock Holmes mysteries and their extraordinary public success at the time that they were published, like these were huge, it makes a perfect illustration of how the Victorian period negotiated tensions between its romantic heart and its modern mind. Sherlock Holmes is the Romantic era's darling, exceptional figure. He's the man of genius, and the mysteries that he works to solve are indeed mysterious and compelling and often kind of spooky. Maybe there's some supernatural involvement suggested. There's a ghost reported to be about or something. Or, as in the case of The Speckled Band, the story might be spooky and mysterious because it makes use of a kind of foreign mystique, playing on the exoticism of foreign lands and cultures that would have been familiar to some Victorian readers, the global British Empire being what it was. In the case of this story, it's India that gives that sense of the exotic. India would have been a country familiar enough to be meaningful to Victorian readers, even intriguing or suspicious, frightening, but not familiar enough to be ordinary, right? These are sort of uniquely Victorian ways of incorporating romantic sensibilities into the tension of a mystery story. That said, Sherlock Holmes is also a modern man. He's a man of science, of letters, of industry and progress, He rigorously applies the scientific method, rigorously for his time. He relies on evidence, He works by deductive reasoning. Towards the end of the story, when he's unpacking everything to Watson, we love that. We live for the end of the story where he pulls the rabbit out of the hat and demonstrates how brilliant he is. When Holmes is explaining everything, he describes one of his early theories, from earlier on in the case, by saying, quote, "I had come to an entirely erroneous conclusion," meaning a false conclusion, "which shows, my dear Watson, how dangerous it always is to reason from insufficient data." Gotta have the data. Gotta be methodical. We are modern people. That's it. There you have it. You can't know just from this story that we've read, But if you were familiar with the larger series of Sherlock Holmes mysteries, you would know that as a character, Holmes is extensively well-read on all the latest subjects. He's very up-to-date. He's an amateur chemist who dabbles in some of the earliest precursors to forensic science. He's industrious, as we see in the way that he conducts his work as an amateur detective. Economically, and this is another kind of Victorian hallmark, economically, Sherlock Holmes is a gentleman. He is in some manner independently wealthy. He doesn't have to have a job. So it's not so much that he works hard to turn a profit. It's just that he works hard because that's who he is. He turns his passion into work ethic and goes about his days vigorously practicing his chosen profession as a private detective, or applying himself to amateur pursuits like chemistry and reading between cases. And that's really a deliberate sort of... those kinds of things are laudable in Sherlock Holmes. They make him sympathetic and a hero to the Victorian reader because they represent back to the Victorian reader things that the Victorian reader valued about him or herself, her own culture, right? This is us. So yeah, in all of this, Sherlock Holmes, both the character and the serial series of stories, were quintessentially Victorian creations. If you think, too, about Helen Stoner, the client in this story, she carries with her a whole lot of that sort of Victorian mystique, Victorian atmosphere, not Victorian, romantic mystique, romantic atmosphere. She's the last daughter, the last heir of an obscure yet ancient noble family line. Her family seat, or home, is a sprawling 200-year-old mansion buried among the overgrown brambles of a few remote acres of property at a place called Stoke Moran. The description from the story goes like this. The building was of grey, lichen-blotched stone, with a high central portion and two curving wings like the claws of a crab, thrown out on each side. Dangerous. In one of these wings, the windows were broken and blocked with wooden boards, while the roof was partly caved in. A picture of ruin. Ugh! So perfectly romantic. I mean, Catherine Morland of Northanger Abbey would just be losing it right now. Helen Stoner in the story tells Sherlock Holmes that, quote, the last squire, the last owner or sort of lord of the mansion, dragged out his existence there, living the horrible life of an aristocratic pauper. But his only son, my stepfather, seeing that he must adapt himself to the new conditions, there's your Victorian cue, obtained an advance from a relative which enabled him to take a medical degree, and went out to Calcutta, India, the farthest reaches of the empire, where, by his professional skill and force of character, he established a large practice. That is your classic transition from a capital R romantic aesthetic, wasting away in a tumble-down mansion, pale and forgotten, to the capital V Victorian sense of things. Industry, empire, progress, adapt to the new conditions. Later on, when Helen asks Sherlock Holmes to take the case, she says, "But I have heard, Mr. Holmes, that you can see deeply into the manifold wickedness of the human heart." And to me, that expresses really quite well the particular way that those old Gothic sensibilities of first-wave Romanticism found new expression in Victorian literature. What Sherlock Holmes demonstrates in his work as a detective, and what a lot of Victorian literature seems to suggest or demonstrate, is that the highly specific, when studied over and over and over again, ultimately reflects the universal. Just like how when you read a trending line on a graph, right, that line shows the overall relationship between individual plot points. So even though Sherlock Holmes, in Watson's words, never involves himself in a case unless it tends toward the unusual or even the fantastic, even so, what Sherlock Holmes ends up learning about through the total stack of all those cases is the basic human condition. By studying perhaps exceptional wickedness, Holmes learns that wickedness itself is not exceptional. He becomes acquainted with the darkness that lives in every human heart, even if, for most of us, it's never roused to criminal action. Hence his comment to his friend, Dr. Watson, when he begins to suspect that his client's stepfather, also a medical doctor, has murdered his own daughter for money. Holmes says, quote, "When a doctor does go wrong, he is the first of criminals. He has nerve and he has knowledge." That's a fact. That's a really sensitive, really compelling example of this Victorian worldview or sensibility that's negotiating between a kind of scientific skepticism on how things really are, and a depth of human sensibility, a depth of emotion and passion as well that are kind of trying to figure out how they live together. For those of you who read Northanger Abbey last week, you'll recall that Henry Tilney sort of scolds Catherine for letting her imagination run away with her, to the point that she dreams up bizarre ideas about a murder at Northanger Abbey. He says to her, "My dear Miss Morland, consider the dreadful nature of the suspicions you have entertained. What have you been judging from? Remember the country, the age in which we live. Remember that we are English, that we are Christians. Consult your own understanding, your own sense of the probable, your own observation of what's passing around you. Does our education prepare us for such atrocities? Do our laws connive at them? Could they be perpetrated without being known in a country like this, where social and literary intercourse is on such a footing, where every man is surrounded by a neighborhood of voluntary spies, and where roads and newspapers lay everything open? Dearest Miss Morland, what ideas have you been admitting?" That's Henry Tilney's speech from this Regency-era novel. But crime and detective fiction in the Victorian era, genres that sprang directly out of the Romantic movement, they pushed back against questions like this. These stories and these authors argued that there is absolutely nothing to say terrible, unthinkable things can't happen right here at home, among advanced people such as we, perpetrated by those nearest and dearest to us. Many of the most prominent Victorian artists felt that to assume these things couldn't or didn't happen at home, that we were above all that, was foolishness. Because looking around them, on the one hand, progress was everywhere you looked during the Victorian period, and there was no country on planet Earth more advanced than England. Yet, on the other hand, to many artists, it seemed that England had never been such a dehumanizing place as it was in that present day. Exactly now, they thought, exactly now at our most advanced, we are also somehow at our most backward and our most corrupt. And in fiction, in various ways, increasingly reflected that. So, Holmes is a great case study on how Victorian art negotiated between what I call its romantic heart and its modern mind, continuing some of the resistance themes that Romanticism had laid out, but in a new key, a new tone, influenced by the scientific advances of the time and their sense of oncoming modernity. Take a break, grab a cup of tea, click on over to the second half of this Part 2 Intro to the Victorian Period.